What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video, and welcome back to my laundry room. So in case you missed last week's video, I have redone our laundry room here. Started by replacing all of the vinyl flooring with tile, so in case you missed that, go check that out. But in this video, I'm gonna show you how I finished the rest of the laundry room. So I built this really nice countertop out of plywood, also built a matching shelf, and I'm really happy with the way it came together. And just like that last video, Lowe's is the sponsor on this week's video, so I wanna say a big shout out to them. And I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the project. So the first step in this project was to get everything out of the room, and this included all of the random odds and ends that had collected on and around the washer and dryer, as well as the washer and dryer themselves, which were due for replacement anyway. To give myself a little bit more room to work and also make filming in this space a little easier, I removed the two doors leading into the laundry room, and clearly these doors had not been removed in quite some time because they really did not want to budge. Lord. So as you can see, this laundry room is really more of a closet. It is super convenient to have it on the second level, but there's definitely not a lot of space to work in there. And this caused some challenges later on as well, especially when getting that countertop into the space. Anyway, after removing the doors, the first item on my list was to get some better lighting in the space, both to make filming easier, but also to make it more pleasant to work in the laundry room. I picked up this super bright LED fixture from Lowe's and installed it, but of course not without some issues. So to my surprise, whoever installed the previous fixture had not added a junction box, so I had to make another trip back to Lowe's to pick up an old work box, get that installed, reroute the wiring to the box, and then install the new fixture correctly. Thankfully, the new fixture gave me a ton more light to work with, and next I could get the crappy wire shelf removed. I personally absolutely hate wire shelving. I think it's ugly, things have a tendency to just tip over on the shelves, and worst of all, they're a bit of a pain to remove. After royally screwing up my drywall during this removal, I looked up a better way to remove these shelves so that I could then relay that info to you. And evidently, if you remove the nail in the center of the brackets on these shelves, they'll come out a lot easier without damaging your drywall as much. The more you know, I guess. Once the shelving was removed, I tackled the flooring, removing the old vinyl flooring and installing new tile. And again, I covered that in a separate video. So go check that out if you're interested. I'll link to the video in the cards and in the comments below. One thing relating to the flooring that I didn't cover in the tile video was installing the quarter round. So first I took some measurements in the space so I could pre-cut the pieces. And this laundry room is on the second level of our house, so running up and down the stairs to make cuts would have been super time consuming. And I actually like to take measurements with a laser tape measure when doing trim work like this, as I find it's a lot more accurate than trying to use a regular tape measure. Anyway, after taking my measurements, I made my cuts down at the miter saw. The real key here is to make sure you're taking your measurements from the long points of the miters. It's really easy to get mixed up during this process, so just take your time. Once the pieces were fit, I could dry fit them in the space, and I did need to trim two of the pieces just a little bit to get them to fit, but overall the pieces fit together pretty nicely. I got this last little piece with a 22.5 degree angle on the end, which I think gives a nice transition to the door trim. With that, the flooring was officially done, so I could move on to the rest of the build. To give this laundry room a ton more functionality, I wanted to build a countertop to go over the washer and dryer, as well as a matching shelf to replace that wire shelf. And I went with plywood here, and there's a good reason that a lot of people use plywood for their laundry room countertops. Laundry machines are a lot deeper than standard kitchen appliances, so standard countertops won't really work. You need a countertop depth of roughly 40 inches depending on your exact washer and dryer, and standard countertops are about 25 inches deep. Sheets of plywood, however, come in 4 foot by 8 foot sheets, and that makes them pretty much the perfect choice. I also decided to do this project entirely out of my garage shop, which I'm just finishing setting up, and I hope to bring you guys more DIY projects from the house versus my fully stocked kind of dream woodworking shop. Anyway, to break down the sheets, I used a combination of my track saw and table saw, but a circular saw and straight edge would work just fine for these larger cuts. I needed a countertop and shelf length of about 72 inches, so I first cross-cut one sheet about an inch over that, so I could then trim off the other factory edge. And this left me with a super clean edge on both sides. I repeated the same process on the second sheet of plywood, and then I could get the sections ripped to width with the table saw. The first piece I needed to cut was the countertop, so I looked over the sheets and picked the best looking section for the countertop, since it would be the most visible part in the final build. Next, I ripped the countertop to width of the table saw, or at least I tried to. So I had purchased a new table saw blade after dulling my blade on my vinyl plank flooring I installed at the shop, and I didn't realize that the blade I purchased was too thin for the riving knife on this saw. And this meant that the riving knife was binding in the kerf as I tried to pass the piece through the saw. And the weird thing is this wasn't an issue on the smaller strips, just on these larger panels. It took me way too long to figure out what the problem was, and I ended up just forcing the pieces through until I finally came to my senses and just removed the riving knife. Now, I wouldn't recommend using your table saw without a riving knife if it has one, as they are a major safety feature. But I had to get these pieces cut so I could finish this project on time, so I moved on without it. After ripping the pieces to width of the table saw, I cut them to length of the miter saw, and I would highly recommend some kind of stop block when cutting your pieces so that you can get them cut to a consistent length. And it means you'll also have a lot less sanding to do later on. And before I move on to assembly, let's hop into SketchUp real quick and I can show you how this countertop will come together, as I had to build it a little bit differently. The water lines and drain for the washer just happened to line up exactly where I wanted the countertop, of course, and I didn't want to lower the box as I still wanted quick access to shut off the water in case I had a leak in the future. So to create some spacing between the wall and the back edge of the countertop, I decided to add a few stacked strips of plywood to kind of act like a thick backsplash. So back to the build, after cutting the trim pieces to length at the miter saw, I could start getting the countertop assembled. First, I added a strip to the front edge of the countertop just to give it a beefier look, and I also added a strip to the front of the shelf so that it matched the countertop. And the strip on the shelf also helped to hide the wiring for the lights that I added under the shelf later on. Next, I started adding the trim along the back edge of the countertop, and as you can see, I made the back trim pieces start 3/4 of an inch below the bottom of the countertop. This countertop's facing down here, so that they would line up with the strip at the front of the counter. I added some glue and tacked the first strip in place with brad nails, and then added 2-inch screws to permanently attach it to the countertop. After getting the first strip attached, I attached the next 2 strips with glue, tacking them in place with brad nails. Last, I added 2 more filler strips along the left and right edges of the counter, again to make the bottom edge of the countertop even for mounting. Finally, I flipped the countertop over, removed any glue squeeze out, and then let the glue dry for a few hours. Once the glue dried, I could get the plywood edges flushed up with the belt sander, and I don't use a belt sander often, but it's perfect for jobs like this, as it tends to keep surfaces a lot flatter than a random orbit sander. It also removes material a lot quicker. After belt sanding, I swapped over to my random orbit sander and sanded everything with 120 grit, also breaking all of the edges. Also, I decided to forego the shop vac since it was upstairs, but I will not be doing that again. You can see the dust storm created here, and just about everything in our garage is now covered in a fine layer of dust. I finished sanding the countertop and shelf with 180 grit, blew off the dust with my blower and compressor, and then I could apply some finish. And I went with a water-based polyurethane here and decided to try something new, applying it with a roller. This was actually extremely quick and easy, and I ended up with a really nice surface finish, and I applied 3 coats, sanding with 320 grit after the second coat. With the finish drying, I could move back to the laundry room to get prepped for paint. I patched all the holes I was left with after removing the wire shelving, and really regretted not being more careful, as this spackling took much longer to dry since the holes were so large. I actually ended up having to delay painting by an entire day because of the spackling, and really should have done this earlier in the project. I added the first round of spackling, let it dry, sanded it with a sanding block, vacuumed off the surface, and then added a second round of spackling and repeated the whole process before moving on to paint. Now, I typically hate painting, but I watched a bunch of videos on proper painting technique and also picked up some good quality paint supplies, and I must say this painting went much more smoothly. First of all, I cut in with a rubber-handled brush designed for cutting in, which made the process much easier. And this room was also great practice for cutting in, since this trim will never be seen once the laundry machines are in. After cutting in, I rolled out the rest of the room, and adding this extension to the roller made a world of difference here. I added 2 coats of paint in total in my favorite color, Repost Gray, and then I could get the countertop installed. To support the countertop, I used 2x4s, but I actually would have used 2x2s if I had to do it again, to make sure they were better hidden in the final install. I cut the 2x4s to length at the miter saw, and then headed up to the laundry room to install them. So my washer and dryer had a height of 38.5 inches, so I mounted the 2x4s at 39 inches high to give them a little bit of extra clearance. I set up my line laser at this height to give me a good reference line around the entire room, and then I marked out the stud locations. I transferred those locations to the 2x4s and partially drove in some 3-inch screws to make mounting the 2x4s easier. To mount the 2x4s, I lined up the top edge of the 2x4 with my laser and drove in the screws, making sure they hit the studs. After adding the 2 screws at the ends of the 2x4, I checked for level just to confirm the laser line and then drove in the other screws. And I just repeated this process for the rest of the 2x4s, which ended up about 4 inches short of the front edge of the countertop so that they would be hidden. Once the 2x4s were in, I went ahead and moved in the washer and dryer and got them hooked up. And this would be next to impossible once the countertop was in, so I needed to get this done before installing it. I also went ahead and bought new water lines for the washer when I got the new appliances, just for some peace of mind. And my alarm system also has a water sensor that I have placed behind the washing machine to alert me of any future leaks. After getting the washer and dryer in place, I swapped the swing of the door on the dryer, which I unfortunately couldn't do on the washer, and then I could get the countertop moved in, which, as I mentioned, was a little bit tricky.
Watch their camera, babe.
Yeah. Am I hitting it?
Yeah.
So after trying to move the countertop in with it oriented horizontally and realizing it was hitting the angled ceiling. Oh crap.
What?
It's hitting the angled ceiling. We reset, moved the dang camera out of the way, and went in with the countertop oriented vertically. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm shocked. I'm so surprised that worked.
And this luckily worked, and the countertop dropped right into place. This wall was a little bit out of square, so it required a little persuasion to fully seat it, but it looked great once it was in. What do you think?
Oh, I think it looks great.
Also, I had initially planned to attach the countertop to the 2x4s with some construction adhesive, but I decided to just have the countertop sit right on top of the 2x4s unattached. Since it's kind of jammed against the wall anyway, it stays in place just fine. And this way I'll have really easy access in case I need to get behind the washer or dryer in the future. Next I could get the shelf installed, and first I mounted the shelf brackets, again using the line laser to set the height. I also marked all the stud locations on some painter's tape so that I wouldn't be left with any marks right on the wall. Unfortunately, the stud spacing is a little awkward on this wall, so I couldn't get things perfectly symmetrical, but I did end up adding one more shelf bracket to even things out. I attached the shelf to the brackets using 3/4 inch screws from below, and then I could install some puck lights to give the countertop better lighting. And these lights are pretty cool. They're super low profile and have a little button that allows you to turn them on and off really easily. They just attached with some included command strips, and I used some packing tape for a little bit of extra cable management. The last thing to install in the laundry room was a few drying racks, which we use for all of our synthetics. And I found these super cool low profile racks which fold flat against the wall when not in use, and they installed with a few included drywall anchors, and I think they look really great in the finished space. And with that, all that was left to do was get everything moved back in and organized. And I picked up these plastic baskets which happen to fit perfectly in the space, and they really help to reduce the visual clutter. And I'm going to go back and add labels, especially to the baskets on the shelves, so that it'll be easier to find everything. But with that, the laundry room was officially finished. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I'm really happy with the way this project came together overall. It's super useful. We're way more organized in here, and this countertop has been really awesome already. So in case you guys want to build something similar to this, I'll have links to all of the tools and materials I use down in the video description below. If it's your first time to the channel, consider getting subscribed and ringing that little notification bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. And last, I want to say a big shout out to all of my YouTube members. If you guys want to check that out, you can get some behind the scenes content, access to my SketchUp files and things like that. You can go check that out. I'll have a link to that on the screen. So thanks for watching, everybody, and until next week, happy building.